The sun beat down on Redemption, Texas, a town that felt less like a promise and more like a dusty, forgotten corner of the world in 1875. Alara knew its every creak and groan, every whisper and stare. She was 20 years old, with hair the color of midnight and eyes that held a hint of wildness, much like the land around them. But it wasn't her own spirit that earned her the townsfolk's watchful eyes. It was the shadow of her brother, Jed. Jed was an outlaw, a name whispered with fear and a touch of excitement in the saloons. He rode with a rough crowd, robbing banks and trains, leaving a trail of trouble wherever he went. Alara, however, was nothing like him. She spent her days mending clothes for Mrs. Henderson, the seamstress, or helping old Mr. Abernathy with his garden. She worked hard, kept to herself, and tried her best to live a life far removed from Jed's reckless path. Yet, in Redemption, blood ran thicker than good deeds. If Jed so much as sneezed near town, folks looked at Alara as if she'd caught his cold. Her family name, once respectable, was now a brand of shame. Children would stop their games when she walked by, their parents pulling them closer. The men at the general store would fall silent, their eyes following her until she disappeared around the corner. It was a heavy burden, this guilt by relation, a constant weight on her young shoulders. She longed for a place where her name didn't come with a history of banditry, a place where she could simply be Alara. But Redemption held her fast, a prisoner to its judgment and its unforgiving memory. She often wondered if she would ever truly be free of Jed's shadow, or if it would forever define her in this harsh, unforgiving land. Alara's quiet life shattered one sweltering afternoon when the town sheriff, a burly man named Silas, pounded on her door. His face was grim, his words sharper than any blade. Jed, her brother, had robbed the bank in a neighboring town, and this time he'd left a bloody trail. But the sheriff wasn't there for Jed. He was there for Alara. "We found this in Jed's saddlebag," Silas grunted, holding up a small, hand-embroidered pouch. Alara recognized it immediately. It was a gift she had made for Jed years ago, a simple token of sisterly affection. "It's got your initial on it. You knew where he was heading. You helped him." Alara's heart pounded like a drum against her ribs. "No, I haven't seen Jed in months. That pouch, it was a gift. I made it for him years ago." Her pleas fell on deaf ears. In Redemption, the truth often got lost in the dust of suspicion. The town had grown tired of Jed's antics, and Alara was an easy target, a scapegoat for their simmering anger. A hurried trial was called, more a formality than a search for justice. The judge, a stern man who rarely looked Alara in the eye, listened to the few witnesses. Old man Hemmings claimed to have seen Alara talking to a stranger on the edge of town, a stranger he just knew was one of Jed's gang. Mrs. Gable swore she'd seen Alara sending a letter through the mail just days before the robbery. Each testimony, flimsy and circumstantial, was twisted into proof of her involvement. Alara stood before them, her voice trembling as she denied everything, but it was useless. The verdict came swiftly, guilty by association. For her supposed part in Jed's latest crime, she was sentenced to 10 public lashes. The words hit her like a physical blow. 10 lashes. For something she didn't do. The injustice burned hotter than the Texas sun, searing her heart with despair. The morning of the lashing dawned hot and merciless, mirroring the anger in Alara's heart. She was led through the main street, the familiar path now feeling like a walk to her own doom. Every step brought her closer to the town square, where a rough-hewn wooden post stood stark against the sky. Around it, a crowd had already gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, grim satisfaction, and cold indifference. Children, usually playing, now stood silent, clutching their mother's skirts, their wide eyes fixed on her. Sheriff Silas, his face unyielding, took her arm and guided her to the post. The rough ropes chafed her wrists as he tied her, binding her tightly, leaving her vulnerable for all to see. Her back was bare to the sun, a canvas awaiting the sting of the whip. She could feel the prickle of 1,000 eyes on her skin, each gaze a judgment, a stone thrown at her already bruised spirit. She heard hushed whispers, cruel jokes, and even a few outright sneers from the crowd. "That's Jed's sister," someone hissed. "Runs in the family, I reckon." Alara lifted her chin, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not cry. She would not beg. Even though her insides trembled like a leaf in a storm, she would face this injustice with what little dignity she had left. She focused on a distant cloud, a small, white smudge against the vast blue, trying to block out the scornful faces, the buzzing flies, and the dread that coiled in her stomach. The sheriff stepped back, taking up the long, thick leather whip. The air crackled with a cruel anticipation, the crowd holding its breath, ready for the first blow. Alara closed her eyes, bracing herself. Just as Sheriff Silas raised the whip, a deep voice cut through the tense silence. "Stop!" Alara's eyes flew open. A tall figure stepped out from the edge of the crowd. It was Caleb, a rancher known for his quiet demeanor and honest work. He owned a spread just outside town, raising cattle with a steady hand. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. He was respected, a pillar of the community, and seeing him there, stepping forward, made the crowd murmur with surprise. Caleb walked with purpose, his gaze fixed on the sheriff, ignoring Alara. He was a sturdy man, with kind eyes that usually crinkled at the corners when he smiled, though no smile touched his face now. His hat was pulled low, shading his face from the sun. He stopped a few feet from the post, his voice calm but firm. "Sheriff, this punishment is unjust. She had no hand in her brother's crimes." Sheriff Silas scowled, his grip tightening on the whip. "She was found guilty, Caleb. The law has been decided." "Then I'll take her place," Caleb stated, his voice ringing with quiet authority. The words hung in the air, silencing the whispers, turning the murmurs into gasps of disbelief. Alara stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what he was saying. Take her place? For her? A stranger, practically. Sheriff Silas blinked, taken aback. "What did you say?" "I said I'll take her punishment," Caleb repeated, his gaze unwavering. 10 lashes. Give them to me instead." The crowd erupted in a confused roar. Some scoffed. Others looked at Caleb with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. No one had ever done such a thing in redemption. Alara felt a strange mix of shock and a tiny, fragile spark of hope flicker within her. Why would he do this? For her. Sheriff Silas, after a moment of stunned silence, looked from Caleb to Alara, then back to Caleb. He scowled, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You're a fool, Caleb," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Still, the law was the law, and a punishment had been ordered. With a heavy sigh, he untied Alara's wrists, her skin raw and red from the ropes. As soon as her hands were free, Alara stumbled back, her legs weak. She watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Caleb calmly stepped forward. He shed his vest and shirt without a word, revealing a strong, broad back. The ropes that had just held her were now bound around his wrists, securing him to the post. He stood tall, his eyes steady, never once looking at Alara. The first lash cracked through the air like a gunshot. Alara flinched, a gasp escaping her lips. Caleb's back arched slightly, but he made no sound, no cry. A red welt bloomed across his skin. The second lash followed, then the third. Each strike was a sickening thud, a brutal testament to his sacrifice. Alara could feel the phantom pain, the deep ache of injustice, but this time it was being borne by another. Her hands flew to her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs that threatened to escape. The crowd, which had been boisterous moments before, was now eerily quiet. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others stared, their faces pale. With each crack of the whip, Alara's shock deepened, slowly turning into a profound, overwhelming gratitude. This man, who barely knew her, was enduring this agony for her freedom, for her dignity. Blood began to seep through the cuts on Caleb's back, staining his skin. By the 10th lash, his breathing was ragged, his body swaying. But he remained standing, a testament to his unbreakable will. Alara's eyes welled with tears, not for herself, but for the quiet, courageous rancher who had saved her. Once the last lash fell, Sheriff Silas quickly untied Caleb, who swayed on his feet, his face pale, but his jaw set. The crowd slowly dispersed, their earlier excitement replaced by a somber quiet. Alara, her legs finally finding strength, rushed to his side. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What?" He turned, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since he stepped forward. They were weary, but still held that gentle kindness. "It wasn't right," he simply said, his voice a little hoarse. Alara helped him put his shirt back on, the fabric sticking to the fresh wounds. She gently guided him to her small, humble home, ignoring the few lingering stares. Inside, she carefully laid him on her cot. Her hands, usually skilled with needle and thread, now moved with a new kind of purpose as she fetched clean rags, warm water, and a jar of healing salve made from local herbs. "This might sting," she warned, her voice soft as she began to clean the blood and dirt from his back. He gritted his teeth, but again made no sound. His stillness was unnerving, yet comforting. As she worked, a hesitant conversation began. "You didn't have to do that, Caleb," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He breathed deeply. "Someone had to. You were innocent. But you don't even know me." He chuckled softly, a sound that seemed out of place with his injuries. "I know enough. I've seen you. You work hard. You're good to old Mrs. Henderson. You're not your brother, Alara." His words were like a balm, soothing the ache in her heart that had festered for so long. He saw her, not just Jed's sister. As she finished applying the salve, he turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers again. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little stronger. "For this." "Thank you," she replied, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "For everything." In that small room, amidst the quiet tenderness of shared pain and unexpected kindness, a seed of something new began to sprout. The news of Caleb's sacrifice spread through redemption like wildfire, igniting a flurry of reactions. At the saloon, men grumbled into their whiskey. "Foolishness," barked old Silas Miller, slamming his glass down. "Taking a lashing for some outlaw's sister? He's gone soft in the head." Others agreed, muttering about Caleb's foolishness, speculating that Alara had bewitched him, or worse, that he was secretly involved with Jed. The usual gossip, fueled by fear and resentment, twisted the noble act into something suspicious. Yet, not everyone saw it that way. Mrs. Henderson, the seamstress Alara worked for, stood up for Caleb fiercely. "He's a good man, Caleb is. Always has been. He saw injustice, and he acted." Her words, though few, carried weight among some of the more sensible townsfolk. Even Sheriff Silas, though he publicly maintained Caleb was a fool, privately found himself thinking of Caleb's unwavering eyes, a new, grudging respect settling in his heart. At the general store, whispers were divided. Some women clicked their tongues, convinced Caleb had ruined his good name. "Sacrificed his reputation for that girl," one scoffed. But others, particularly those who had daughters of their own, looked at Caleb's ranch in the distance with a thoughtful gaze. They remembered Caleb's quiet honesty, his helping hand, and they wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, his heart was bigger than their town's judgment. Alara felt the weight of these divided opinions as she stepped out the next day for supplies, Caleb still recovering in her small home. The stares were different now. Some held the old scorn, but many were mixed with a new curiosity, a hint of admiration, even a flicker of guilt. Caleb's act had not only saved her from the whip, but it had also, in a strange way, begun to chip away at the solid wall of judgment that had surrounded her. It was a slow change, but it was a change nonetheless. A week passed, and Caleb, though still stiff, was well enough to return to his ranch. Before he left Alara's small home, he turned to her, his gaze steady. "Alara," he began, "my ranch hand Jedediah, he rode off last month. I could use another pair of hands, if you're willing." Alara stared at him, surprised. The idea was bold, unheard of for a woman in redemption. Women didn't work ranches, not like that. But then again, no man had ever taken lashes for a woman in redemption either. A rush of hope, mixed with a little fear, surged through her. Working on a ranch would mean leaving the whispers and judgmental stares of the town behind. It would mean a new purpose, a chance to truly start fresh. "Are you serious, Caleb?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, serious as a rattlesnake in summer. "It's hard work, mind you. Long days. But there's a small cabin and good food, and no one will bother you out there." His last words were spoken softly, but Alara understood their meaning perfectly. He was offering her not just a job, but a refuge, a shield against the town's lingering judgment, a place where she could finally breathe. A wave of emotion washed over her. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, Caleb. I'll take it. Thank you." And so, within days, Alara packed her few belongings. She said her goodbyes to Mrs. Henderson, who squeezed her hand and offered a rare, knowing smile. The stares from the townsfolk were still there, but now Alara met them with a new confidence. She was no longer just Jed's sister, nor was she the girl sentenced to public shame. She was Alara, and she was heading toward a new life, a new beginning, on Caleb's ranch. The dusty road that led out of redemption felt less like an escape and more like a path to freedom. Months melted into seasons on Caleb's ranch. Alara, true to her word, proved to be an invaluable hand. She learned to mend fences with surprising speed, her small hands nimble with wire and hammer. She helped brand calves, her fear of the bellowing beasts quickly replaced by a calm efficiency. She cooked hearty meals that filled the small cabin with welcoming smells, and her presence brought a quiet warmth that Caleb hadn't realized his solitary life lacked. Caleb, for his part, was a patient teacher. He showed her how to saddle a horse, how to read the sky for changing weather, and how to coax a stubborn cow back into the herd. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but his actions spoke volumes. A nod of approval, a shared glance over a task well done, the way he always made sure she had the easiest chore when the sun was hottest. These small gestures built a bridge between them, sturdy and unspoken. Alara found a peace on the ranch she had never known in town. The vast, open skies, the rhythmic sounds of nature, and the honest, hard work filled her days with purpose. She saw Caleb not as the man who had saved her from public shame, but as a fair boss, a steady presence, and slowly, surely, a friend. Their conversations grew longer over the evening stew, talking about the cattle, the weather, and sometimes the quiet dreams they held. Caleb would speak of improving his herd, of the land's future. Alara, emboldened by his trust, would share stories from her childhood, things she hadn't dared to speak of in years. The shame of Jed's actions began to fade, replaced by the simple, profound joy of being truly seen and valued for who she was. Their bond deepened with each sunrise and sunset, a slow, gentle blossoming of trust and mutual respect, rooted deeply in the Texas soil. One evening, as the stars began to prickle the vast Texas sky, Alara and Caleb sat on the porch of his cabin, the day's work done. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush. Alara, emboldened by the quiet comfort that had grown between them, finally spoke of the day he saved her. "Caleb," she began, her voice soft, I don't know if I've ever truly thanked you for what you did, for taking my place. It was the kindest, bravest thing anyone has ever done for me." Her voice trembled slightly, remembering the crack of the whip, the sight of his bloodied back. "I was so lost, so afraid. You gave me back my dignity and a chance to live again." He shifted, looking out at the dark horizon. "You don't need to thank me, Alara." "But I do," she insisted, turning to face him. "Why did you do it? You hardly knew me. You risked your own well-being for a stranger, for someone the town had already judged." Caleb took a slow breath, his gaze still fixed on the distance. "My own sister," he began, his voice low. "She was accused of something she didn't do years ago in another town. They didn't have a Caleb to stand up for her. She ran off, and I never saw her again. It always haunted me." He paused, a deep sadness in his eyes, as he finally met her gaze. "When I saw you tied to that post, I saw her. I knew what it felt like to be alone against a world that had already made up its mind." A wave of understanding washed over Alara. His act wasn't just about her. It was about healing an old wound within himself, a silent plea for justice that he couldn't offer his sister. It was a profound revelation, pulling back a curtain on the quiet rancher's past, revealing a depth of empathy she hadn't fully grasped. In that shared moment of vulnerability, their bond deepened, moving beyond gratitude and respect, touching something tender and true in both their hearts. After Caleb's heartfelt confession, a new, unspoken tenderness settled between them. It wasn't a sudden, fiery passion, but a deep, quiet affection that grew like the sturdy oaks on the ranch. They worked side by side, their movements often in sync, a comfortable rhythm flowing between them. During calving season, they spent long, exhausting days and nights tending to the new mothers and their wobbly offspring. A shared look of triumph when a difficult birth succeeded, a comforting hand on an aching shoulder after a long ride. These small moments wove their hearts closer together. One particularly harsh winter, a fierce blizzard swept through, threatening the cattle. They spent days huddled together in the barn, keeping the animals warm, sharing meager rations, and fighting off the biting cold. In the dim lantern light, Alara saw the lines of worry etched on Caleb's face, and she felt a fierce protectiveness bloom in her chest. He saw her strength, her unwavering spirit, and knew she was more than capable. It was in these trying times, facing the wildness of the Texas land, that their love solidified. It was a love born of shared burdens and quiet understanding, a love that didn't need grand declarations. It was in the way Caleb made sure her coffee was always warm before she headed out, or the way Alara would instinctively reach for his hand when a storm rolled in. It was in the comfortable silences, the knowing glances, and the deep, abiding trust that they had each other's back, no matter what. Neither of them spoke the words, "I love you," aloud, but they didn't need to. Every sunrise they greeted together, every chore they completed side by side, every evening spent beneath the vast, star-strewn sky whispered it louder than any words ever could. Their love was a quiet, unyielding force, as real and enduring as the land they worked. The annual Harvest Festival was the biggest event in redemption, a rare occasion for the scattered ranching families to gather in town. Alara and Caleb rode in together, a familiar sight to anyone who bothered to look. She wore a simple dress, carefully mended, and her hair was braided down her back. Her eyes, once downcast in town, now met the gazes of the townsfolk with a calm, steady light. Caleb, beside her, looked as solid and dependable as ever. As they dismounted, the usual murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some still held suspicion, but many others greeted Caleb with respect, their eyes lingering on Alara with a new curiosity. They watched her move with a quiet confidence, no longer the timid girl shadowed by her brother's name. Later that afternoon, after the horseshoe toss and the pie-eating contest, the mayor stood on a makeshift stage to give a short speech. The townsfolk gathered, including Sheriff Silas, Mrs. Henderson, and even Old Man Hemmings. Alara stood beside Caleb, a comfortable warmth flowing between them. Suddenly, a brave, defiant thought sparked in her heart. This was her chance to reclaim her name, and to honor the man who had given her a new life. She took a deep breath, and before the mayor could finish, she stepped forward, her hands still linked with Caleb's. The crowd hushed, surprised by her sudden movement. Alara looked out at the faces, some still skeptical, some now openly curious. Her voice, usually soft, rang out clear and strong. "Folks of redemption," she declared, her eyes shining with a newfound resolve. "Many of you judged me, condemned me for the sins of another. But one man here saw past that judgment. He stood for what was right, and he saved me." She squeezed Caleb's hand, looking up at him with a love that was plain for all to see. "Caleb has given me a home, a purpose, and a love I never dreamed possible. And today, before all of you, I want to say that this man, Caleb, is my husband." A stunned silence fell over the harvest festival crowd. Alara's declaration hung in the air, bolder than any sermon, more profound than any whispered gossip. Caleb, who had been surprised by her sudden speech, now turned to her, a soft smile slowly spreading across his face, a silent promise in his eyes. He squeezed her hand, confirming her words without needing to say a thing. Then, a ripple went through the townsfolk. Old man Hemmings, who had testified against her, slowly removed his hat, his face thoughtful. Mrs. Henderson wiped a tear from her eye, a joyful smile replacing her usual stoic expression. Even Sheriff Silas, standing a little straighter, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of respect. The whispers began again, but this time they were different. There was no scorn, no judgment. Instead, there was a sense of awe, a grudging admiration, and for many, a dawning understanding. They remembered Caleb's sacrifice, Alara's quiet resilience, and the months they had spent working side by side. They saw not an outlaw's sister, but a brave woman who had found her own way, and a good man who had stood by her. A few women began to clap, softly at first. Then others joined in, until a wave of applause, heartfelt and genuine, swept through the square. Children, who had once stared at Alara with fear, now looked at her with wide-eyed wonder, seeing a heroine in their midst. The wall of judgment, built so high around Alara for so long, finally crumbled, replaced by acceptance and respect. Alara felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years, a freedom that tasted sweeter than any spring water. She was finally seen, truly seen, not as Jed's sister, but as Alara, a woman loved and respected. As the applause softened, Alara turned to Caleb, her heart overflowing. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners she now knew so well. He simply nodded, a silent acceptance of her public declaration, a quiet promise of their shared future. Together, hand in hand, they walked through the crowd, no longer feeling the weight of the past, but the embrace of the present. The townsfolk parted for them, their gazes no longer filled with judgment, but with a newfound respect and even admiration. They left the festival, the sounds of laughter and music fading behind them as they rode back to the ranch. The Texas sky was a canvas of deep blues and purples, the first stars beginning to twinkle. Alara leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder as they rode, feeling completely safe, completely cherished. The journey to his ranch, which had once felt like an escape from her old life, now felt like a homecoming to their new one. They built their life together on that ranch, under the wide-open Texas sky. Alara became not just his wife, but his partner in every sense of the word, her strength and spirit a perfect match for his quiet wisdom. Their love, born out of a profound act of sacrifice and nurtured through shared hardships and quiet moments of tenderness, grew stronger with each passing year. It was a love that defied injustice, that proved kindness could bloom in the harshest of lands, and that true courage wasn't just about fighting, but about standing up for what was right, even when it meant bearing another's pain. Alara, once a prisoner of her brother's shadow, had found her own son in Caleb's steady heart, forever bound by a love as vast and enduring as the Texas plains.